It is the voice of Indiana County, WCCS 101.1 FM and AM 1160. We're talking with Thomas Wolfe about his new book, The Called Shot, Babe Ruth, the Chicago Cubs, and the unforgettable Major League Baseball season of 1932. And boy, was it. Thomas Wolfe visiting with us from Chapel Hill, North Carolina, one of my favorite places in all the world. Good morning. How are you today?
Good morning. I'm doing well, Todd. Glad to be able to talk some baseball today.
Well, absolutely. And boy, do we need it. I mean, baseball is supposed to be designed to be a long, drawn-out, great stroll through the summer. And this year, it certainly isn't that. But it's so good to look back on the season of 1932. And not only the baseball season, but the world as a whole. It was a really, really seminal year, wasn't it, in American society, in American history, and certainly in baseball?
Yeah, 1932 was really a pivotal year for the country. We were in the midst of the Great Depression, of course. Prohibition had failed, but was still technically in effect. There were demonstrations in the streets of our nation's capital. The World War I veterans were demonstrating and hoping to get their World War I bonuses. And it was a presidential election year. We had an unpopular Republican president in the White House, in Herbert Hoover, who was doing his best to deal with the country's problems. But the Hoover versus Roosevelt campaign in 1932 is a terrific presidential campaign, a part of our national history also.
Well, FDR even makes it into your book, as well as all kinds of characters from that era, recalling and evoking so many different great historical moments. I want to talk about the buildup, though. I said that baseball season is designed to be a long stroll. It really is, and you do us the favor of walking us through the baseball season and meeting some of the great legends. I've always been fascinated by Rogers Hornsby. Who is, I think, one of the most today underrated, but certainly not in his day, underrated baseball players ever.
Yeah, I would certainly agree with that. Hornsby was a great hitter. Arguably, he's the greatest right-handed hitter in the history of the game. I suppose people might argue about Hank Aaron or Willie Mays, but Hornsby hit over 400 in 3 different seasons. In one of those seasons, he not only hit over 400, he also led the league in home runs. So he wasn't just a singles hitter. And his career batting average at .358 is second only to Ty Cobb. So as a hitter, he was really the best in the game as a right-handed hitter during his years and perhaps in all of baseball. He had his faults, but as a right-handed hitter, you couldn't fault it.
Well, yeah, and one of those faults is the Rogers Hornsby personality. He was not well liked in his own locker room, and here he is. He's playing such a pivotal role in your book and in this 1932 baseball season as the manager of the Cubs, and it's really fascinating to watch the way his own team relates to him, let alone the way that everybody across the baseball landscape relates to Rogers Hornsby. There was a certain amount of fear and hatred involved with him.
Yeah, that's true. People loved his bat, loved what he could do as a player, but he was not a particularly social individual. He wasn't well liked by his teammates, and he wasn't well liked by players he managed. He was very strict. Didn't smoke or drink or read the newspapers. He thought reading damaged one's eyes, although he did read the daily racing form. He did keep up with horse racing, but yeah, he was a difficult guy to get along with. But owners kept wanting him on their team because he could hit the ball, and the truth is he was a very good student of the game and a good teacher. He was actually pretty good at teaching young players the fundamentals of the game, but he didn't really work out very well as a manager.
Rogers Hornsby, Kai Kyler, some of the personalities that we meet in this game. And then there's this fellow Ruth. And the whole book turns on Babe Ruth and the called shot. And I'm not going to give away what actually happens on that day, which, as you called it, maybe the most famous at-bat in the history of baseball. But Babe Ruth in his day was something amazing. He is past his prime by the time the 1932 baseball season comes along, and yet he is, after all, Babe Ruth, and he has a way of taking center stage, does he not?
Taking center stage was what he did best. He loved the big stage. He loved the adulation of the fans. He loved competitive moments, and he was really a master of moments. As much as has been written about Ruth as kind of a fun-loving guy, he liked to drink, he liked to party, he liked women. When he was on the baseball field, and especially when he was in the batter's box, he had an incredible ability to concentrate on the moment, and he loved being there. He loved being the center of attention, and fans loved him too. I mean, he is an iconic figure and probably the most charismatic athlete of the 20th century, with the possible exception of Muhammad Ali. But here we are, 88 years after the 1932 season. We're still talking about Ruth as if he's with us, and in a way he is with us because he's so emblematic of the game.
Yeah.
And probably 100 years from now, we'll still be talking about Babe Ruth.
Well, there's a connection between Babe Ruth and the city of Chicago. As a Red Sox pitcher, as a Red Sox pitcher, he's in the World Series in Chicago, and here he is back in 1932, years later, with the chance to play in his very last World Series. We're in Game 3 by the time we get to the game of the moment here, as we talk with Thomas Wolfe about his book, Babe Ruth, the Chicago Cubs and the unforgettable Major League Baseball season of 1932. Yankees are up 2-0 in the series, and the Babe is in New York, and you do such a masterful job of capturing the moment of his coming to the plate. And if we could just spend a little bit of time without giving it away, let's set the stage as the Babe walks to the plate. He's been jeered and just absolutely verbally abused, and he's given some of those shots right back to the Cubs players and the fans. It's a whole different atmosphere than we're thinking of today. Take us into that moment.
Okay. As you say, the Yankees won the first 2 games in New York, and the third game was played in Chicago on October 1st at Wrigley Field. And although Ruth had participated in the World Series in 1918 as a pitcher with the Red Sox against the Cubs, those games were actually played in Chicago. The Chicago games were played at Comiskey Park. So in 1932, Ruth was playing in Wrigley Field for the very first time. And it was a sellout crowd, actually more than capacity, 50,000 fans, which included the Commissioner of Baseball, Judge Landis, the Mayor of Chicago, Anton Cermak, and most notably, the Governor of New York, Franklin Roosevelt, who was honored by the Cubs and allowed to throw out the first pitch. So Ruth had this incredible audience. Throughout the series, as you know, he had been jeered and taunted by the Cubs, and then in Chicago by the Cub fans. The Cub fans threw lemons at him when he was taking fielding practice, threw lemons at him when he came to bat. And in the first inning of Game 3, on his first at-bat in Wrigley Field, in fact, the first time he swung at a pitch in Wrigley Field, he hit a 3-run homer. Now, in the 5th inning, the score was tied at 4-4. Charlie Root was on the mound for the Cubs. The Cubs players in the dugout, especially Guy Bush, who would be the pitcher who would face Ruth and the Yankees the next day, were shouting insults at Ruth. And Ruth stood there taking it all in and giving it right back, pointing, gesturing, and predicting about what he was going to do at that at-bat.
I love the atmosphere, the bedlam that it must have been, and you even point out that Ruth's wife is sitting nearby, and she says something in that moment that I think maybe a lot of people let slip by, and they don't really understand what's going on there. But she mentions the little boy. Right.
That's interesting because that particular anecdote, which is in the book, hasn't been written about very much. But on the morning of October 1st, before Ruth went to the ballpark, he went to the hospital to visit a young boy who had been injured in a bombing incident in Chicago and blinded by it. And Ruth had a habit, of course, of reaching out to children, and especially children in distress. That's one of the charms and realities of Ruth's life. But when Ruth was at bat in the fifth inning, supposedly his wife called out to him, "Remember the little boy." And that kind of is an echo of something that happened in the 1926 World Series when Ruth was playing against the St. Louis Cardinals. And during a rain delay in St. Louis, Ruth was given a ball to autograph for a young boy in New Jersey named Johnny Sylvester. And Sylvester had been injured in a riding accident. And Ruth wrote on the ball to Johnny, "I'm going to hit a home run for you tomorrow." And Ruth did not only hit one, he hit 3 home runs in that game in 1926. So Ruth had a way of promising things to young boys and promising home runs and fulfilling it. And that seems to be what happened also in the 1932 series in this famous at-bat.
No. Man, you do such, as I said, a masterful job of taking us into the moment, of taking us into the era. This is a time when baseball really is a northern game, and the players, it's actually a northeastern to north central United States game because it's not east of the Mississippi for all intents and purposes. It's not down south, and they're going from city to city by train. It just must have been a wonderful atmosphere in which to live.
Yeah, you think about the players. As you say, they traveled by train and they traveled with reporters, so that there was an interesting bond between reporters and players. And reporters of that era were very supportive of players and did not dig into or report on the players' behavior off the field. So there was a kind of bonding there. And there was a kind of bonding in the trains also that I think is absent in professional sports today, in that those long train rides offered an opportunity for veteran players to tutor younger players and rookies. I think there was a lot of coaching and mentoring going on just in the way that they traveled together. So it was a very different kind of environment. It was in 1932, considering the Depression, being a Major League Baseball player was really a great thing. So many people were unemployed that year, and to be able to have a game, be able to earn your living by playing a game and earning a pretty substantial salary for the Times was something that was quite remarkable, really, for the players.
It was a wonderful, wonderful time. And particularly also a stressful time in American society. There were a lot of different dynamics going on. A lot of them relate to today's environment as well. Thomas Wolfe, you've done us a great favor with this book. I enjoyed it so very, very much. Where can people learn more?
Well, you can learn more about 1932 just by buying and reading this book, of course. I'm encouraging people to read the book and learn the story. And I have actually a long bibliography at the end of the book, so for people who want to know more, there's lots of biographical material available both in book form and online.
Thomas Wolfe, thanks so much for visiting with us. It's been great fun. It is the voice of Indiana County, WCCS 101.1 FM and AM 1160. AM 1160. AM